Folks, as you know, social media censorship is growing. The best way to support our video work for Israel is to subscribe to our video newsletter on pulseofisrael.com and to share our videos. If you are already a subscriber, then thank you. 2 additional ways to connect with and support Israel. They are so simple. 1, click on this link to help us strengthen Israel by strengthening Judea and Samaria. It's simple, everybody. Just click on the website and choose the best option that works for you to strengthen Judea and Samaria. And number 2, enjoy the beauty of Israel whenever you want. No matter where you are in the world, you can enjoy our online virtual tours of Israel. Just visit israelisbeautiful.com and choose the virtual video and activity package that works for you. Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. Today, I am with David Rubin. David Rubin runs an organization called the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, but he is also the author. He is the author of 7 books, and the latest one, which has just come out, is called Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel. So we're going to start going into understanding what this book is about, what are the lessons that America can learn from Israel, what is about the left that David has understood after all these years. So let's get into it with David Rubin. Shalom, shalom, David. How are you?
Shalom, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank God, doing very well. So I understand confronting radicals, what America can learn from Israel. First of all, let's talk about what radicals are you referring to?
Well, there are mainly 2 radicals that we're referring to. One is the radical left in America. And of course, in Israel, we confront mostly the Muslim radicals, the Palestinian radicals, as they call themselves. And one thing that I noticed in the past year and a half in America, or going on 2 years, of these wild protests, that were called peaceful protests, the George Floyd protests.
The Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes.
Okay.
And they were called peaceful protests. And they grew, and they grew, and they grew. And before we knew it, there was rioting and looting in multiple American cities. And when I saw New York City, where I grew up, I've been living in Israel 30 years, but I grew up in New York City. And when I saw New York City all boarded up,
right,
Manhattan, Macy's Herald Square, 12-story department store, all boarded up, Tiffany's, Bloomingdale's, all of the famous American stores all boarded up. The Empire State Building was closed down. I realized that something was going on that was a lot bigger than an anti-racism peaceful protest. And then I started to notice other things, that there were piles of bricks on every street corner that people could take and use and throw at the police, and throw at civilians who they didn't like. There were Molotov cocktails being thrown, which we in Israel have experienced for decades.
Yeah, we're used to, unfortunately.
Hey, Molotov cocktails, those homemade firebombs, for those of you viewers who don't know what that is. We're talking about serious low-level warfare. And I came to understand that Black Lives Matter, which is a far-left movement, which truly is not just there to protest racism, and that they take their cues from the Muslim radicals in Israel, in the Middle East. They have learned a lot from the Muslim radicals. And what I'm saying is that people in America, basic fair-minded people who believe in God, believe in family, in the traditional family, believe in hard work and a merit-based society, those people need to look to Israel for guidance. Does that mean that Israel has all the answers? Of course not. But we're people that has roots that go back thousands of years. There's biblical Israel, there's modern Israel. We have learned slowly over time from our successes, but also our mistakes. And I think that's something that Americans can learn from as well.
And I think I'll interject, because in Israel we don't only deal with the Muslim radicals, we deal with the radical left as well, which is slowly but surely taking more power away from government and the authorities, making more and more of a inroads into the DNA of authority, of the police. We just experienced here in Israel, the police stood down as our Arab Israeli citizens rioted and lynched Israeli citizens in Israeli cities, and the police stood down. Why? Because they've been infiltrated by this.
There is a connection. Well. There is a connection. The radical left organizations that are in Israel that basically are fighting for the Palestinian radicals. They're all connected with the radical left in America.
Right.
You know, there's a whole network there. They're heavily funded by the radical left in America.
Right. And Europe.
And Europe. Oh, absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, the book's emphasis, Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel, has its emphasis on the United States. But absolutely, Europe is steps ahead of the United States in terms of radicalism, in terms of the radical left, and in terms of the radical Muslims. Now, I should point out that there is very, very strong collusion between the radical secular left and the radical Muslims.
The red-green alliance.
You could call it that. It sounds very smooth, very, very nice marketing term, but it's actually very frightening because they want something that's very different in the long term. The secular left would like to have some sort of global world where secularism is the norm and where Marxism rules, and or some form of Marxism. Maybe they'll call it democratic socialism. But as we in Israel know and have learned, and which I wrote about also in the book, socialism, democratic socialism, is ultimately not democratic.
Right.
Because one thing we learned in Israel is that when you have democratic socialism, which we had for about 30 good or not so good years, about 35 of them, it doesn't work, number one, as an economic system.
David's referring to the first 35 years of the state of Israel,
from 1948,
which was run by socialists, the state of Israel, basically. Right?
That's right,
the Labor Party.
And so they were in control for 35 years, and so you could look at it and say, well, they had the right to vote. People had the right to vote in Israel, and so it's a democratic society. It's a free society.
Democratic socialism. Okay,
but not free. Why? Because socialism by nature, you're giving the government control of the main means of production. You're giving government control of the main utilities. You're giving government control, most importantly, of the media. And there was one television station in Israel for that entire period of 35 years, plus some years after that. It took a while to undo. There was one television station. It was controlled by the government. And in fact, you had to pay a fee to the government if you wanted to have a television. There was one health fund. There was no competition between the health providers. And there was one labor union, the Histadrut, which was a mega labor union. And if you wanted to get ahead, you had to belong to the Histadrut. So that was Israel at that time. There was a glass ceiling, which still exists to some extent, but it's gradually fading away, which would not allow religious soldiers to become officers at any high level. And, thank God that has faded as time has gone by. It still exists a little bit. It still
exists
at the very top tier.
Right.
But half of the soldiers in officers' training programs are now from religious backgrounds. Right. So that's what socialism was for Israel. 445% inflation in the early 1980s. And Menachem Begin, who was the first non-socialist prime minister, when he came into power, it was basically a rebellion of the masses.
Right, this is the year 1977, the Mahapach.
Correct. But it took him a few years. For the first few years, he was struggling because every time the Histadrut, the mega labor union, did not like something he did, they shut down the country with nationwide strikes. So it took several years. Then all of a sudden we had this massive immigration coming from the Soviet Union, from the former Soviet Union. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews coming from the former Soviet Union.
Hundreds of thousands. Right. Just making clear for everyone. Not hundreds or thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands,
right.
Which is what I was trying to say. So they were coming flooding in. What is a prime minister to do? As Menachem Begin would say in English, what was a prime minister to do? Well, he had to find the funding somehow. He asked President Ronald Reagan to provide loan guarantees so that Israel could finance the influx and the absorption of these immigrants. And Reagan said, "No way."
Yes, go.
You want help from us? Open up your economy. They sat down, they made a plan for opening up the Israeli economy. So Reagan and Begin working together undid socialism in Israel. And now, as most people know, Israel has a roaring free market economy, which is the envy of much of the world, high tech on very high levels. And that, but that's a lesson from the mistakes of Israel. And it was one of the worst mistakes we made. Understandable why it happened, which we could go into another interview, but it was a mistake. And looking back at that, and looking at what's happening in America, where 50% of college-age youth consider socialism to be a positive thing, that tells me that there is what to learn from Israel.
Okay, and everyone, again, I'm speaking with David Rubin, author of Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel. So right now we were just learning from you in terms of learning from Israel's mistake of economic socialism. What other lessons can America learn from Israel in terms on the more ideological fronts of the radical left?
Okay, well, of course we have this problem of the far-left movements in America, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Antifa movement, and all of the associated movements. There are a lot of groups and organizations that are associated with them that have a similar ideology. And basically, they are emphasizing something that seems on the surface to many Americans as being something positive.
Right. They know how to hijack language to make it seem as if you're virtuous and human values and human rights, where in the end it's evil.
They're against racism, they say.
Right.
Okay, and if they're against racism, well, I'm against racism. You're against racism. What could be wrong with that?
Right.
The problem is that it's all a front. When people are burning American flags at public demonstrations, when people are setting fire to government buildings, when people are throwing Molotov cocktails, firebombs at police officers, when they are burning Bibles, when they are tearing down monuments to American heroes and vandalizing them in the grossest language, That's not a peaceful protest against racism.
It's not even a protest against racism.
And yes, and Israel has what to teach about that as well, because we've seen the peaceful protests of the Palestinians fighting for their rights, fighting for the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, right? Isn't that what they always say? However, what we know is that it always turns into a riot. It always turns into violence. And when we see the actual results, we know what the goals really are. The goals are to tear down Israel. And we see the same thing happening in America today, where these far-left radicals are looking to tear down America as a Judeo-Christian civilization. That is their goal, and it could not be clearer from the actions of what they're doing. In Israel, we've had heroes too. We've had heroes who've made mistakes. If you look at the American heroes, whose statues are they pulling down? Whose names are they removing from government institutions and boulevards? George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. Great American heroes. Benjamin Franklin. Why are they doing that? Well, the argument, at least the stated argument, is that, George Washington had slaves. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Okay, well, that's what you tell people who are ignorant of history. But if you study the history, you see that the whole world had slaves at that time. And that the founding fathers of the United States were against slavery in principle. They realized it was something that was going to have to be done away with at some point. And of course, it eventually was. So we have a concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, which means improving the world, fixing the world. Okay, but the actual expression is tikkun olam b'malchut Shaddai, which means that you fix the world, you improve the world in God's kingdom, according to God's guidelines. And those are the guidelines that were given to us in the Hebrew Bible, which the founding fathers of the United States believed in, right, and quoted at the Constitutional Convention. Benjamin Franklin quoted those guidelines and those morals, and so did Thomas Jefferson. So that improvement of the world is something that the United States has done quite well. They had slavery. They did away with the slavery over time. Yes, they had segregation. They had Jim Crow laws in the South afterwards. They did away with that. Women didn't have the right to vote. They achieved the right to vote. There are so many things that the United States proved itself to be a place where they could do tikkun olam, they could do the improvement of the world, and they did it in the right way. Now, in Israel, as I was saying, so we've had heroes like King David and King Solomon, and we've had the more modern heroes like Ben Gurion and Theodore Herzl, who was the founder of modern Zionism. And there's a lot to criticize there. Okay? Theodore Herzl was avowedly secular. He just wanted to recreate Israel to get away from the anti-Semitism. And Ben Gurion, he had all of his issues with the Yemenites who came, who were avowedly religious, who were staunchly religious, and they started disappearing to secular agricultural communities, and they were put in all the secular schools. They had their religious way of life torn away from them. We could criticize Ben Gurion for that. We criticize him for a lot of things. We criticize him for the socialism. But still, he had an important role in the creation of the State of Israel. And Theodore Herzl, of course, was the visionary for the modern state of Israel, for political Zionism, and the actual attainment of a state. King David, King Solomon, I don't need to go into their mistakes, but we read about it in the Bible all the time. We learn from them.
Right, and that's an important concept in Judaism. It's understand no man is perfect. Even our heroes have imperfections. Even Abraham, the forefathers, King David, we learn about their mistakes, and we don't idealize them as perfect human beings. We look up to them for their positive traits that we learn from, and we also learn from their mistakes and their negative traits. Every single person is like that. And just translating what you're saying, what we're experiencing in America is these radical left throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, okay, you want to complain about the slavery that existed? You can do that, but by tearing down these statues and destroying the foundation of the United States of America, you're going to bring the whole tower falling down instead of just pinpointing on that was a mistake. And then you also see the hypocrisy, because while they're trying to destroy the foundation of America and the founding fathers because they own slaves, well, they are silent about the modern slavery that still exists today, mostly in the Arab Muslim world.
Correct.
In Africa. So you think you're so pious because you're calling out, we have to take down George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but you are quiet about actual slavery taking place today. And what about the slave shops of Nike in China? And you're still wearing Nike shoes? So the hypocrisy screams to high heaven, and no one's talking about it. No one's bringing it up, and they're going to bring down all society down with their hypocrisy.
A society is built on its foundations. The key word is foundation that you mentioned. And that's a society is built on its foundations. You tear down the foundations, you tear down the building. Now, unfortunately, that is the goal. That is the goal of the radical left in America, in Europe. The goal is to bring down Judeo-Christian civilization.
Right.
To bring down Israel, which of course is the original biblical nation, and to bring down the United States, which has adopted those biblical principles. And that's what it's all about. So when they're looking to do that, people who don't agree with Marxism, people who don't agree with the assault on the traditional family, and all of this gender confusion and semantic confusion, people who feel that way need to take a stand and need to do so exactly like what the left did. Because you have to understand, this all started in the 1960s. The 1960s, which are glorified in America. Right. The great Woodstock generation and the idealists of the 1960s. Well, yeah, there was some idealists and there was a lot of good music, but beyond that, it was a disaster. It was the beginning of the end of the traditional American family. Yes, I know it still exists in some pockets, but there was an assault on the American family. And so radical lesbians, like the three women who started Black Lives Matter, and other people, they are the ones who are trying to tear down American society. Now, the traditional family was the bedrock of American society. There was a time when people would, mothers and fathers would raise their children. They would have, 4, 5, 6 children per family. Obviously, birth control did away with some of that, but it was also the society and the selfishness that was brought about, the selfishness of Marxism. Marxism says that what's in it for me? That the person is at the center. Okay, but Judeo-Christian civilization says that God is at the center, and we're here to do His will, and we're here to be better people, and we're here to improve ourselves and to improve the society.
Right. Right. No, and just to translate that 100%, and the way I like to explain it is the God-centric lifestyle that we get from religion is, at least in Judaism, and I think this is in Christianity as well. What's our responsibility to society? And like John F. Kennedy said it.
That's right. He said it
best. Well. Right. It's not what's his exact quote? It's not what you can. Ask not what you could do for. Ask not what the country can do for you. Ask what you can do for the country. If that's not exactly correct, forgive me.
For your country,
for your country, right? But that's the God-centric. Is what can I do to help better society? Well, what can I do to help? And we work on ourselves, we work on our families, the concentric circles, and then that way we impact society. As opposed to the Marxist socialist is what is society going to do for me, and I'm going to be taken care of. So it's the selfish aspect of it,
right? And so if you want to learn also from Israel in the bigger sense. Okay, nowadays everyone says Israel, they're talking about the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. But Israel, through the centuries, meant the Jewish people.
Right, the nation of Israel.
So if you want to learn from Israel, so take a look at all of the Jewish immigrants who came to the United States in the early part of the 20th century. They came with only the clothing on their backs. Most of them were very poor, with the exception of some of the German immigrants who came in the early part of the century.
Right.
Most of them were very poor. And there was a lot of discrimination against them. So what do you think they did? Did they call for a day of rage? Did they riot in the streets? Did they loot? No, just the opposite. They worked hard.
Very hard.
And they worked around the clock. They worked in the sweatshops on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And they worked very, very hard. And they made peanuts in the beginning, but they worked hard and they worked their way up, eventually becoming the managers of the factories in the garment district, eventually owning their own factories in the garment district, and little by little moving their way up. They couldn't get into certain professions, so they went into other professions. And they made sure that their children worked hard in school. Education, which is the bedrock of the Jewish people, of course, tracing its roots back to the learning of the Torah, learning biblical studies, but they made sure that children worked hard, and the family was the core of making sure that happened, that education and hard work. So when I see people rioting in the streets and looting, stealing, that's totally contrary to our values. And it's totally contrary to the values on which the United States was built.
100%.
So I encourage people in America, those who are conservative, those who, or those who are mainstream, and they believe in these values that we're talking about, these values that are essentially values that come from Israel. And I emphasize that change does not happen from the top. True, some change can happen from the top. And I know a lot of people elected President Trump, and they figured, okay, we'll get the GOP members into Congress and all this. And yeah, a lot of change can happen that way. But the change that happened after the 60s by these grassroots left-wing movements is what changed America. People like the head of the Weather Underground is a good example.
Saul Alinsky.
No, Saul Alinsky was the socialist theorist from before that.
Okay.
But the head of the Weather Underground was Bill Ayers.
Oh, Bill Ayers, right.
Okay, so what did he do after he stopped blowing up the Pentagon and scheming terror attacks on government buildings? Bill Ayers became a professor of education, radical education. And he threw all his efforts into changing things at the grassroots. Now, he was just one individual, but there are many others like him. And so, he became Obama's mentor in Chicago, and all of this. But there were so many others. And another interesting thing happened in the 1970s. A lot of these radical leftists from the 60s seemed like they were joining the me generation. They went into the corporate world. And there was a lot written about it. People were saying, well, have they left their ideals? Have they become the establishment? Well, yes, they became the establishment, but a lot of them didn't leave their left-wing ideals. And
we're seeing it today.
You see these radical leftists who grew up through the corporate system. And yes, it's not an accident that Twitter is closing down, shutting down, canceling out. Twitter, Facebook, so many others that are canceling out those who have views that are right of center, or those who are pro-Israel. And a pro-Israel speaker can't go to an American university without being heckled and threatened violently.
Right. On a university campus, which is supposed to be the place of freedom of ideas, but it once was. And in fact, in colonial times, Hebrew, the language of Israel, was a prerequisite. In every Ivy League school, you had to take Hebrew. And you could give a commencement address in Hebrew. And yes. So, in fact, the chancellor of King's College, which eventually became Columbia University, said that Hebrew is the foundation of a young man's education. Wow.
Interesting, right?
Wow.
So that was what college was like. It was a place of dialogue where you could talk and discuss anything. And in fact, when we talk about these radical leftists who are trying to take over America, a lot of times I hear various commentators calling them extreme liberals. It's not true.
No, they're not liberals.
A liberal is someone who is open-minded, who believes in having a
right. Today's left they're closed-minded ideologues. They're not liberals at all.
Yes.
And so it's interesting because I follow. First of all, I was when the Black Lives Matter protests began, I was very vocal in calling it out, saying this is nothing about Black lives. This is about destroying America. And I was getting smashed by friends and colleagues in America saying, how can you do this? The Black community is looking to us. You're a Jew. You're from Israel. We should be standing with them. I'm like, I'm all for Black lives. But this is going to do worse for Black lives. And it's about destroying America. It's not about helping Black lives. And since I've been following a lot of Black voices, American Black voices, and what they have been saying, again, contrary to, they've also been anti-Black Lives Matter. They're Black lives, right? Why are they against it? They're like, our cause is being hijacked. Black lives, our families have been decimated. How many the rate of single motherhood in the Black community is astronomical.
That's right.
There is no assistance to help families, to help kids. The inner cities that are all under Democratic rule for decades have been decimated by the Democratic Party. This whole virtue signaling, oh, it's the Democrats and the Black Lives Matter that are out to help Black lives. Not at all. They're making our lives even worse. And it's not about helping Black lives at all.
Yes, and one thing that we've learned here in Israel, when we see riots, is that you do not appease. Appeasement does not work. So, what we in Israel did through, the whole Oslo so-called peace process was that we appeased the Palestinians, appeased the Arabs of the land of Israel who call themselves Palestinians. And appeasement doesn't work. We said, okay, we'll give you autonomy in 7 cities in Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank. And And we figured, okay, or at least those on the left said, well, that'll bring peace. We'll be together. We'll give them autonomy. They'll have, eventually we'll be able to give them an independent state in the biblical heartland of Israel, and everything will be peachy dandy. It'll be like Switzerland and Austria. Get along just fine. Right. Well, it didn't happen. Didn't happen that way. And I see now in Israel, it's very hard to find people, or at least they're a very small minority in Israel now, who are in favor of having an independent Palestinian state. The two-state solution, land for peace.
Yeah, most Israelis have learned.
Most Israelis have learned from that. But Americans are still appeasing. They will appease these rioters, and they say, okay, well, we'll half fund the police. We won't defund the police completely. We'll reduce the budgets to the police department. And by doing that, of course, they're hurting the very people who they're claiming to help.
Right. All those communities that the police departments have had their budgets slashed, crime has skyrocketed. And again, while crime hits everyone, the ones who it hit the most are those low-income communities where plenty of black families live. So they're hurt more by the slashing of the budgets. And just going to your appeasement thing, like I'll just bring up 2 points just for the benefit of the whole of everyone watching. One of the diplomatic moves that Israel appeased our enemies, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, is we expelled 10,000 Jews from their homes in the Gaza Strip. The 21 Jewish communities were destroyed because we thought, oh, okay, the world says if there are no Jews living, right, here it's the left saying, oh, we have to learn how to coexist. But when it comes to us, they say, wait, in order to coexist, you have to destroy Jewish communities, expel Jews, so only the Arabs live on their own. It has to be Judenrein, and then you'll have peace. Fine. So Israel did that. And Gaza, instead of turning into Singapore, they didn't take advantage of developing their economy and making life good for them. They ended up turning into a terror base that over the past 20 some odd years, they've grown in their ability to destroy Israel. And then on just to appeasement to the past few weeks, here, the day Hamas started shooting rockets, just to remind everyone, it started, it was the Jerusalem Day, the celebration of Jerusalem Day, where we celebrate the reunification, the miraculous reunification of Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War. And that morning, I was planning on going up to the Temple Mount, right? We liberated the Temple Mount on this day. What better way for a Jew to celebrate and thank God for the miracle of liberating the Temple Mount than visiting our holiest site, the Temple Mount? Yet the state of Israel officially said, no, we're forbidding Jews because we're going to appease the Muslims because they plan to riot. I have pictures of all the rocks that they gathered on the Temple Mount to stone us and use violence against us.
Like the bricks on the corner.
Like the bricks on the corner, exactly, right? So that was appeasement number one on the morning of Jerusalem Day. Then later, we usually have a traditional march for Jerusalem that goes through the whole old city, including an area where Muslims live. Every year, since 1967, since the march began, we have this march. And this year, Hamas basically threatened, oh, you guys march through the old city where the Muslims lived? We're going to shoot rockets. So what did the state of Israel say? Oh, we're going to appease them. So no march this year through the old city of Jerusalem. So we appease them in the morning, we appease them in the afternoon, evening, and then what do we get at the end of the day? They shot their rockets anyway, and they launched their war. So appeasement, and this is something that our own leaders have to learn, and that we have to teach our leaders here in Israel as well as America.
That's right.
Stop appeasing our enemies. Appeasement only empowers them and enables them to move forward, to use even more terror and anarchy against us to tear apart our societies. So appeasement does the opposite of helping anybody, and it hurts everybody.
That's right. So that's one of the main points that I bring across in Confronting Radicals, what America can learn from Israel, is that appeasement does not work. And it's a mistake, a tragic mistake. And I see America making that tragic mistake today. Yes, obviously, we have learned, I believe we have learned about the Oslo so-called peace process, that it was just brought terrorism, and
It's pushed peace further away, not brought it closer.
Look, we saw when the Oslo peace agreements were signed in 1993, there was this outbreak of optimism.
On the Israeli side.
On a big part of Israel really believed that it was going to change things. And the Israeli educators went to work on changing the textbooks and what they said about the Arabs. But they weren't changing their textbooks.
Right. Their textbooks are still set to destroy Israel and kill
all
Jews.
of this was happening. And then the outbreaks of terrorism. The most massive terrorism that Israel had ever experienced happened in the mid-1990s up to 2000, and then from 2000 on, it was from 2000 to 2006 were the worst waves of terrorism Israel has ever experienced. Every single day there was a terrorist attack, and I myself experienced it personally when I was attacked while coming back from Jerusalem one day. Our car was ambushed. I had my 3-year-old son sitting in the toddler seat behind me. The car was hit by terrorists.
And you were shot with guns?
There were Palestinian terrorists on the side of the road with AK-47 assault rifles.
And they shot up your car.
And they shot up the car, and I got a bullet in my leg. The car went completely dead when the bullets hit. I couldn't get it to start. I tried. I shifted gears. The car was dead. It wasn't starting. They were still shooting.
How are you sitting here?
Then I remembered. Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you. So
how did you survive that? Wow.
So the blood was flying out of my leg. I turned around to my son, my 3-year-old, and I asked him if he was okay. His eyes were wide open. His mouth was wide open. He looked like he was trying to scream or cry, but no sounds were coming out. And I didn't see any blood on him. And admittedly, it was a very dark night, and there were no lights on the road at that time. So I figured he was just in shock, and I turned around and tried to start the car again. I shifted gears. I turned the ignition over and over. Finally, the car started. It started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas. I drove 110 miles an hour to get away from the terrorists, and so I drove up the road, and there was an ambulance in the next community up the road. Normally there was an ambulance stationed at the entrance, so I pull up to the front gate. I start screaming for an ambulance, and the guard at the gate, in Samaria and Judea, we have these metal gates at the entrance to the community to keep out the car bombers. And so I shouted at the guard. He didn't seem to hear me, and I couldn't get out of the car because of my leg. And I'm shouting, ambulance, ambulance. There was a young woman on the side of the road. She started jumping up and down, screaming, ambulance, ambulance, don't you hear? At that point, everyone who was within sound's reach came running up to the car. A gas station attendant from across the street who I knew ran up to the car. He ripped off my shirt. He wrapped up my leg
to stop the bleeding,
stop the blood flow. He said, I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing. And he said, here, call your wife. And I tried to dial him. My hand was shaking too much. He dialed it for me. And I told my wife I've been shot in the leg. Hopefully soon an ambulance will be coming and take me to the hospital, and our son is okay. Well, at that moment, an ambulance pulled up. They ran up to the car, the paramedics. They pulled my son out of the car. One of them starts shouting to the ambulance. He's also been shot. He's been shot in the head.
In the head?
In the head. A bullet had gone into his head. We later found out where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. They quickly wrapped his head with bandages, attached him to an oxygen tank in the ambulance, put me on a stretcher in the ambulance as well, and took us to the hospital in Jerusalem. And they got to work on us in the emergency rooms, and thank God, a couple of operations later, we both survived, and we're alive and well today. But one thing that I realized after that happened, and by the way, I was pronounced the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in that particular hospital in just that previous year and a half.
Wow.
So, and that's what it said. All newspapers, 1,000th terror victim. Dubious honor, right?
Wow. But how is your son today? How was he affected by that?
Well, he survived, as I said, and he's alive and well today.
Thank God.
There's been a lot of trauma over the years, and so many children have suffered from that trauma. And, one way of giving thanks for our miraculous survival was what came out of it. And we have an expression in Hebrew, Hakol Tovah. Everything doesn't mean it means everything is for good. It doesn't mean everything that happens is good. We know that bad things happen to good people, but it means that everything happens for a good reason.
Right. We just don't always understand.
And so yeah, we survived through God's miracles, and I felt like I had an obligation. The great Jewish historian and philosopher Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, once said that anyone who has been through a trauma has an obligation to tell the tale. And that's what I remembered that at that time. And what came out of that was the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. People outside of Israel would know it as Shiloh, right? But Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And the purpose is to heal the trauma of the terror victim children and rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel through those children by restoring the lost innocence to their lives. So we have therapeutic and educational projects. We have a campus with over 2,000 children who are being healed from the trauma of terrorism that so many children in Israel suffer from.
Wow. So for everyone who's joined, speaking with David Rubin, author of 7 books, and the latest one, Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel. And he was just telling us about the terror attack that he survived together with his 3-year-old son. Thank God. So going back to the book, David, why should people buy this book?
Well, look, the main reason is to get educated, to know what you're up against. Okay? There was a lot of confusion. Okay, and we discussed this a little bit. There was a lot of confusion when the whole Black Lives Matter Antifa movement started, and people were out there rioting in the streets, and everyone was put on the defensive. Anyone who believed in the traditional family, who believed in hard work, who believed in Israel and the connection between the United States and Israel, anyone like that was put on the defensive.
But by the way, it's important that you said that, because for people who do not know, part of the manifesto of Black Lives Matter is against Israel. Again,
strongly against Israel.
So it's an anti-Semitic movement. It's not about Black lives. It's this movement that's also anti-Semitic. So yes,
that's right. And we saw them out there. We saw them out there demonstrating, and we saw people apologizing over the next year. People were apologizing all the time. Somebody would accidentally talk about a mother or a father. They apologized for saying the word mother and father. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, approved of a motion in Congress saying that mother and father are words that should not be used in Congress.
Right.
That has to be parent number 1, parent number 2.
Right. Even though it was very interesting, because I was following that when it happened. I imagine it still exists today. But if you look at her official bio, I don't know whether it's on Twitter or Congress, whatever, it says proud mother, proud grandmother, right? So everything she's now trying to change the rules against, she herself goes against.
Politics. It's all politics. She is on the defensive within her own party, on the defensive from the various left-wing radical Muslim movements. And sadly, that's what the Democratic Party is becoming.
Right, right.
And but people have to know how to fight back.
They have to know what they're fighting against and how to fight back.
And how to fight back.
And how is that?
Because fighting back doesn't mean taking bricks from the street corners and throwing it at those who disagree with you. Fighting back means doing what the grassroots movements on the left have been doing for the past 50 years, which is getting involved at the grassroots level, getting involved in education. It's not an accident that in American public school education, you cannot use the word God. And if you do, you very well might get thrown out of a job.
Right.
That you can't pledge allegiance to the American flag anymore without being ridiculed.
Right.
It's not an accident that all that has happened, because that is the methodical work at the grassroots level by the left.
Right. And then translating that to actual action for people.
Join the school board.
Exactly. It's take over the school board. Have all the people that believe in family values, believe in God, believe in the work ethic to work hard and get somewhere in life, join the school board and make the difference in your school boards, join the district boards, join the whatever. It's you and your friends getting involved, and then making the difference from the bottom up.
Exactly.
And then then electing the right people at the top to then make the changes from the top. But don't wait for that. Make it happen from the bottom.
It's a multi-level approach, and getting involved in the media and creating media. Those are all important steps. If you have the ability to create media, there's a fella. There's a fella who his name escapes me at the moment, but he has a very, very successful company in America called My Pillow.
Yeah, Mike Lindell.
Mike Lindell, of course. Okay, Mike Lindell has just started a television network. Okay, so I'm saying the people who can do it, start a network, start a media, get involved at that level. And the people who can't do it themselves, well, get involved at the lower levels in media and speak out and say what has to be said. And don't ever let them intimidate you. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't say all lives matter, for example.
Right.
These are important principles. And if you do it at the grassroots level, then you will eventually make a difference.
Right.
Okay, it's a big if.
Right, and it takes
it's a
time.
Big challenge.
And it takes time. And I'll just bring this up because the left knew it would take time. They knew it would take decades, and their approach was the water approach. How do you make a dent in the rock? You just the water keeps on dripping and dripping and dripping, so it doesn't make a difference in a day or in a year, but over decades it makes a dent in the rock, and that's what the left has done. And this is something I learned. I don't know if you saw this video, and if you're interested in it, I could send it to you. A Russian dissident, right, who used to work for the KGB, was interviewed back in the 1980s on an American news program. I forgot which news program. And he said, this is back in the 1980s, he said, listen, right now, Russia has already, in terms of communism has already infiltrated the one generation of universities, of college professors. When we infiltrate 3 generations, meaning he was talking we coming from the communists, when communism infiltrates 3 generations, America's going to fall apart. It's irreversible. He was telling them back in the 80s, it's irreversible. Well, today, basically, I don't want to go in the pessimistic view of saying it's irreversible, but yes, they've accomplished 3 generations. But this has been a plan of communism for decades.
Yes.
For decades, they've worked very hard. So in terms of the religious, conservative, family-valued people like us, and this is something we're dealing with in Israel as well today. Yep. But also for Americans, is we got to take the long approach. We got to start today. Understand this is the war. They've been at it for decades. We have to start now. We have to start in putting ourselves, starting from the bottom and making these changes on the grassroots level with our friends and family in our communities and our schools, etc., etc. And so it's going to be painful for a number of years, but that's how we're going to bring about the change necessary. If we just put up our hands and say we lost the fight, then of course you lost the fight.
Right. We have to say, okay, we're doing it for the next generations, and that's really the answer, And in Israel, thank God, the traditional family is getting stronger. More and more people are getting married. More and more people are having more and more kids, more and more children,
and not just in the religious sector. That's
right.
That's
right.
You
go to secular Tel Aviv, you will find
the average is still 3-4 kids. I don't have the official numbers, but it's around 3-4 kids average, even in secular.
And in America, and in the secular part of America, if you have 2 kids, it seems overwhelming.
Right. And if I could just add one more point, I'd love to hear your thought about this as well. The most important place for people to invest is in their children, because we cannot rely. Not that we can't rely. We have to be on guard against the values our children are being taught in the schools, on social media, from television and movies. So it's now parents, if you want to think about the next generation, it's not just about the school board. Be active participants in talking to your children about these issues so they don't get brainwashed by the leftist ideology that is overcoming us from all sides: social media, television, movies, and even in the schools where the kids are learning it. So that is the most important thing parents should be focused on in order to make the fight for the next generation. Save your kids, that they don't get brainwashed. And that, believe it or not, is the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing.
It is. It's the most important, though.
Right. All right. So how do people buy the book, David?
Okay. Well, Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel, is available through several ways. You can go to davidrubinisrael.com. Okay, that's my website, where people can find out also about my other books there, as well as see some neat videos of my other media appearances. And you can also go to Amazon. You can go directly to Amazon.
Which do you prefer?
And well, it doesn't really. Well, look, the truth is, if you go to davidrubinisrael.com, then you're going to hit a link that takes you to the Amazon. Okay. So you can go straight to Amazon.
Got it.
And just type in the words "Confronting Radicals: What America Can Learn from Israel," and I guess you'll have your book in no time.
All right, folks, this is a very, very important topic that again affects all of us. So if you are someone who cares about the future, who is attuned to the fight that the radical left is doing to change our societies, and you want to make a difference against it and understand it and educate yourselves and educate other people, then definitely click on the link that I'll provide and buy David's book, Confronting Radicals: What America Can Learn from Israel. David, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Pleasure speaking to you. Everybody, I hope you feel enriched by hearing from what David had to say. Purchase the book. Let's make a difference. The future is up to us, to each and every one of you, and the future is bright as long as we take our part in what we can do to help society be a better society. It's up to us, starting with us, our families, our communities. Let's go do it. Signing off from the eternal and ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, this is Avi Abel for the Pulse of Israel. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.